Hey guys, tonight we step out onto a landscape that looks familiar only if you squint really hard and then give up. Because you're standing in the heart of North America at a moment when cold has decided to stop flirting and fully commit. You breathe in air that stings your nose instantly, the kind that makes every inhale feel like it's been filtered through a freezer aisle. Snow squeaks under your boots, not crunches, squeaks, because it's that dry, that cold, that unforgiving. The sky is pale and stretched thin, a washed-out blue that promises nothing except more of the same. You can't see the Great Lakes yet. That's the point. They're here technically, but they're about to be erased so thoroughly that even memory seems optional. And yes, before you ask, you probably won't survive this without modern insulation, a heated car, and a very strong emotional support blanket. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what your local time is. It's oddly comforting to imagine this frozen world connecting to warm bedrooms and late-night kitchens around the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're still here, standing on solid ground that feels suspiciously temporary. The cold hasn't peaked yet. It's building quietly, persistently, year after year. This is the early stretch of the last ice age, and one mainstream fact anchors you immediately. Temperatures across the northern hemisphere are dropping enough for massive continental glaciers to begin forming, driven by subtle shifts in Earth's orbit and tilt. Nothing dramatic, no instant apocalypse, just long, patient cooling. Snow that doesn't melt in summer, winters that linger, summers that fail to do their job. You can almost hear the planet shrug and say, "Fine, we're doing this." At first, it doesn't look impressive. Snow piles up in familiar places, then overstays its welcome. You watch as layer after layer presses down on the ones below, squeezing air out, turning fluffy white into dense blue ice. It's slow, almost boring, which is exactly why it works. Glaciers don't rush. They accumulate. Somewhere to the north, near what will one day be Hudson Bay, ice thickens enough to start behaving like a thing with intentions. It spreads outward under its own weight, not sliding so much as oozing, deforming, creeping south at a pace slower than your fingernails grow but relentless enough to rewrite maps. You feel the shift before you see it. The wind sharpens. The horizon loses contrast, blending land and sky into a single pale smear. The idea of lake becomes fuzzy. Remember, the Great Lakes Basin already exists, carved by ancient geology long before humans. But right now it's just a low spot waiting to be claimed. Historians still argue whether early glacial advances immediately merged ice over these basins, or whether there were brief, stubborn intervals of open water clinging to existence like a bad habit. Standing here, you wouldn't bet on the water. As the centuries tick by, yes, tick, because geological time still insists on rhythm, you notice something unsettling. The snowline keeps moving south. Forests retreat. Tundra replaces them. Animals you recognize from documentaries, woolly mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, begin to favor the margins, living close enough to the ice to access meltwater in summer, but far enough away not to be crushed by it. A quirky tidbit floats through your mind. Some Ice Age mammals likely used compacted snowfields almost like highways, moving faster across frozen terrain than through muddy ground. Even extinction-bound giants appreciate good infrastructure. You're now close enough to the forming ice sheet to hear it. Not with your ears, exactly, more like with your bones. A deep, low groan pulses through the ground, the sound of unimaginable mass adjusting itself. This will eventually be called the Laurentide Ice Sheet, a name that sounds elegant and academic, which is hilarious considering it's basically a continent-flattening menace. At its peak, it will be more than 2 miles thick in places. For now, it's still assembling like a slow, icy thought coming together. The Great Lakes, Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, Ontario don't exist as names yet, but their future basins are already being bullied. Ice begins to spill into them from multiple directions, filling valleys, smoothing ridges, pressing down with enough force to make the Earth's crust flex. This is another solid mainstream fact. The weight of the ice will eventually depress the land by hundreds of meters, a process called isostatic depression. You don't need the term right now, you feel it. The ground seems tired, like it's sagging under a burden it didn't agree to carry. You pause, imagining water beneath all this. Lakes are supposed to move, to lap and sparkle and freeze only on the surface. Here, movement is denied. The ice doesn't just cap the lakes, it replaces them. Water is locked away, compressed, pushed aside, sometimes drained entirely as ice dams redirect flow elsewhere. The Great Lakes region is on its way to becoming one continuous, frozen mass. A single, unified ice field where individual basins lose their identity. It's like watching 5 personalities merge into one extremely quiet, extremely heavy roommate. There's a strange beauty to it, though. Moonlight turns the ice faintly silver. Snowdrifts sculpt themselves into soft ridges that look almost deliberate, as if someone cared about aesthetics while ending ecosystems. You make a mental note that if humans ever show up here much later, they'll find erratic boulders, massive rocks dropped miles from their origin, and wonder who dragged them there. Spoiler: no one. Ice did it casually. You crack a tiny joke to yourself, something about preferring this over summer humidity, and immediately regret it as the wind bites harder, reminding you that sarcasm offers zero thermal protection. Still, there's a calm settling in. The world has simplified. No cities, no roads, no notifications. Just cold pressure time. You realize that this frozen takeover isn't dramatic in the Hollywood sense. No countdown, no villain speech, just accumulation. That might be the scariest part. As the ice thickens, the future Great Lakes vanish completely beneath it. You can walk carefully over where Lake Michigan will someday ripple with sailboats, and there's nothing to tell you it was ever water at all. Historians still argue whether early melt phases created temporary subglacial lakes even during maximum advance, hidden pockets of water trapped beneath kilometers of ice, warm enough to flow, cold enough to stay secret. If they exist now, they're far below your feet, whispering their way through darkness. You take one last look south where the ice hasn't reached yet, and then back north where white stretches endlessly. This is the moment the transformation becomes inevitable. The cold has settled in. The lakes have been claimed. And you standing here feel very small, but oddly relaxed. There's something soothing about a world that moves this slowly, even if it's moving straight over everything you know. You don't notice the glacier moving at first, and that's the trick. If you stare at it, nothing happens. If you leave for a decade, just hypothetically, because you absolutely cannot survive that, you'd come back to find the ice has advanced, quietly occupying space it never asked permission to take. This is how glaciers learn to creep, not by sliding like a sled, but by flowing, deforming, and subtly rearranging their own internal crystals. Under pressure, ice behaves less like a solid and more like an incredibly stubborn liquid. A mainstream fact slips in here, gentle but important. Glacier ice moves because gravity pulls on its mass, causing it to spread outward from thick centers toward thinner edges. No wheels, no drama, just physics doing a very slow push-up. You walk alongside the ice margin, boots crunching over snow that has been compacted by wind into ripples, almost like frozen sand dunes. The face of the glacier rises ahead of you, not as a clean wall but as a messy front of bulges, fractures, and embedded debris. Rocks are frozen into it at all angles, like the ice swallowed a mountain range mid-chew. Every now and then a sharp crack echoes, sudden rifle-like, followed by a long, low settling sound. The glacier is adjusting its posture, redistributing weight. It's alive in the way a continent can be alive, which is to say, it doesn't care if you're watching. The snow that feeds this thing falls gently, almost politely. Each winter adds another layer and each summer fails to remove it. Over time, snowflakes lose their individuality, pressed into granular firn, then into dense blue ice. You can see the color change where the glacier has fractured, pale at the surface, deepening into a rich, translucent blue below. That blue comes from light scattering through tightly packed ice crystals, absorbing reds and reflecting shorter wavelengths. Beautiful, which feels unfair given the ecological consequences. Nature does that sometimes, delivers destruction with excellent visual branding. As the ice thickens, it gains confidence. It pushes outward faster, still slow by human standards, meters per year, maybe a few hundred in steeper areas, but unstoppable. The Great Lakes basins lie directly in its path, shallow bowls ready to be filled. You remember how lakes usually work. Water flows in, water flows out, life circulates. Here, circulation is replaced by compression. The glacier pours into valleys, bulldozing soil, grinding bedrock, and smoothing everything beneath it like an enormous sheet of sandpaper. This grinding action is another mainstream fact worth tucking under your mental blanket. Glaciers erode landscapes through abrasion and plucking, scraping surfaces and yanking loose chunks of rock as they move. You pause to rest, leaning into the wind, and notice the fine powder coating your sleeves. That's rock flour, microscopic particles ground from stone by the glacier's base. Someday, when the ice melts, this flour will cloud meltwater rivers and give future lakes that milky turquoise color people photograph and immediately put on calendars. Right now, it's just grit in your teeth. Glamour has a long incubation period. A quirky tidbit drifts in as you watch the ice inch forward. Glaciers can move faster at night. Slight temperature changes and shifts in pressure can alter how ice slides over its base, meaning this entire frozen mass may be subtly more active while everything else sleeps. You imagine the ice advancing under moonlight, making progress while no one's looking, which feels rude but on brand. If glaciers had personalities, they'd absolutely rearrange your furniture while insisting nothing changed. Beneath the ice, things get stranger. Pressure at the base can lower the melting point of ice, creating thin films of water that lubricate movement. This means that even in brutal cold, parts of the glacier are wet underneath, sliding, slipping, flowing in the dark. Historians still argue whether this basal melting was widespread beneath the Laurentide ice sheet or confined to specific regions with geothermal heat and pressure anomalies. Standing here, you can't tell, but the idea that liquid water exists under miles of ice adds a subtle, unsettling warmth to your thoughts. You follow the glacier southward in your imagination, watching as separate ice lobes begin to merge. What were once distinct flows, one pushing into the future Lake Superior Basin, another into Michigan, another toward Erie, start to lose their individuality. They meet, press together, and become one continuous mass. Boundaries blur, directions simplify. The Great Lakes region is no longer a collection of basins but a unified frozen expanse, the ice smoothing over differences the way time smooths over arguments you no longer remember starting. The land responds, slowly and with visible discomfort. Under the weight of the ice, the crust begins to sink. You wouldn't notice it day to day, but over centuries, entire regions bow downward. This sagging deepens the basins further, setting the stage for future lakes that will be deeper and differently shaped than before. It's like the ice is pre-editing the landscape for a sequel it doesn't plan to stick around and watch. The wind picks up and you tuck your chin, appreciating how little there is to smell here. No vegetation, no damp earth, just cold and clean emptiness. You make a small joke to yourself about this being the ultimate minimalist aesthetic, white on white, zero clutter, and then immediately wish for clutter, warmth, anything with edges. Still, there's a calm that seeps in. The glacier's pace invites it. Nothing is urgent here. Even catastrophe takes its time. You notice animals at the periphery, shaggy shapes moving cautiously, keeping their distance from the ice wall. They know instinctively that this thing is not to be challenged. Early human ancestors, far to the south for now, will one day learn the same lesson, skirting ice margins, using meltwater corridors, treating the glacier as both a resource and a threat. For the moment, though, the ice is learning to move and everything else is learning to step aside. You walk forward expecting resistance, water maybe, or at least the suggestion of a shoreline. But there's nothing to stop you. No lapping waves. No reeds frozen mid-sway. Just ice stretching flat and pale in every direction, as if someone erased a whole chapter of geography with one very thorough swipe. This is where lakes used to assert themselves, carving identities out of rock and flow. Now they've been reduced to a rumor beneath your feet. A mainstream fact settles in quietly. During peak glacial advances, the Great Lakes basins were completely overridden by ice, eliminating surface water for thousands of years at a time. Not frozen lakes, absent lakes. You try to imagine Lake Superior here, all cold depth and inland sea attitude, but the scale doesn't translate. The ice doesn't dip or ripple to acknowledge what lies below. It's indifferent. Snow drifts blur any hint of basin edges, smoothing everything into a gentle, deceptive plane. This is how memory gets lost, not with drama but with uniformity. You could walk for days and never guess you're crossing 5 future lakes, each with its own personality, each currently flattened into anonymity. The silence is heavier than the cold. Sound has nowhere to bounce. Even the wind seems to lower its voice, sliding across the surface rather than arguing with it. Every so often you hear a distant boom like thunder swallowed by cotton. That's the ice shifting under its own weight, adjusting to slopes you can't see. It's unsettling but also oddly rhythmic, like the slow breathing of something too large to notice you. Beneath you, the pressure is immense. Miles of ice press down into the bedrock, squeezing it, cracking it, prying loose blocks that get incorporated into the glacier's base. This is plucking at work, one of the glacier's favorite hobbies. Rocks are torn free and dragged along, leaving scars that will someday guide rivers and shorelines. You're standing on a future map being actively edited. Historians still argue whether erosion or pre-existing tectonic weaknesses played the dominant role in shaping the deepest Great Lakes basins. The ice, unbothered by the debate, does both. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you trudge on. The ice above buried lakes can preserve ancient air bubbles, trapping samples of the atmosphere from tens of thousands of years ago. Somewhere below, tiny pockets of prehistoric air are sealed away, quietly holding information about carbon dioxide levels, volcanic eruptions, even distant wildfires. You exhale, amused by the idea that your breath, right now, would be considered an invasive species down there. There's no sense of direction anymore. Without landmarks, north and south lose meaning. The glacier doesn't care about your compass. It flows according to thickness and gravity. This merging of ice over the basins turns the Great Lakes region into one continuous frozen system, hydraulically and physically connected. Any meltwater that forms doesn't pool on the surface. It vanishes downward, threading through cracks and channels, reappearing miles away or not at all. Surface hydrology, that neat network of rivers and lakes, is temporarily canceled. You pause, listening, and imagine the water that used to be here. Fish, currents, seasonal cycles, all suspended, displaced, or destroyed. Yet life doesn't entirely give up. Microbes persist in tiny pockets, clinging to mineral grains, surviving in darkness and pressure. It's humbling and a little creepy. Life, apparently, didn't get the memo about this being an inhospitable frozen wasteland. The land itself seems to sigh. Under the ice's weight, the crust continues to sink, deepening the basins even as they're erased from the surface. This is the paradox you're walking across. The lakes are being destroyed and improved at the same time. When the ice eventually leaves, it will have carved deeper bowls than before, ready to fill again. Destruction with a long-term redevelopment plan. You crack a small joke in your head about the Great Lakes going through a minimalist phase, stripping down to essentials. The humor feels thin, but it helps. The scale of time here is dizzying. Thousands of years pass with almost no visible change. If you stayed still long enough, you'd become part of the ice's story, buried, compressed, possibly preserved in an unflattering pose for future scientists to argue over. Historians still argue whether early humans ever witnessed fully ice-covered Great Lakes or only their retreating margins. Standing here, you suspect that if anyone did see this, they didn't stick around long enough to write reviews. This is not a landscape that invites nostalgia. It invites endurance, patience, and the kind of quiet acceptance that comes from knowing you are temporary. As you keep walking, the idea of lake fades from your mind, replaced by texture. Wind-carved snow, faint blue fractures, scattered debris frozen mid-journey. Memory itself feels like it's freezing, slowing, smoothing out details. That's how the Great Lakes vanish. Not with a bang, but with a soft, relentless press. You feel it before you fully understand it. The sense that something vast has finished assembling itself and is now comfortable taking up space. The ice beneath your boots is no longer just an extension of local snowfall or wandering glaciers. It has become part of a single, continental presence. This is the moment the Laurentide ice sheet truly takes command. A mainstream fact anchors the feeling. At its greatest extent, the Laurentide covered most of Canada and pushed deep into what will one day be the northern United States, unifying regional glaciers into one colossal system. The Great Lakes basins are no longer individual victims, they're absorbed territory. The ice thickens noticeably here. You don't measure it, you sense it in the way the horizon flattens, the way the surface subtly domes upward toward the north. The center of the ice sheet lies far beyond your view, but gravity broadcasts its location through the slow outward flow beneath your feet. Everything moves away from that thick heart, including you, if you stood still long enough. The glacier isn't advancing so much as breathing outward, exhaling ice in every direction. This is where separate lake basins finally lose their last arguments for independence. Ice lobes that once behaved like neighbors now behave like a single organism. Flow lines merge. Pressure equalizes. The boundaries between future Lake Michigan and Huron dissolve entirely, buried under ice that doesn't recognize names or maps. You walk across invisible seams where ice once came from different directions, now welded together by cold and time. Remember the squeaking snow from earlier? It's gone. The surface here is hard-packed, polished, almost indifferent. The weight is staggering. Miles of ice press down with such force that the Earth's crust responds like a stressed mattress. It bends. It yields. This isn't metaphorical, it's measurable, and it's happening now. The land beneath the Great Lakes region is sinking deeper than ever, setting up a rebound that won't finish until thousands of years after the ice leaves. Historians still argue whether the deepest parts of today's lakes owe more to this glacial depression or to pre-ice age river erosion. The answer, as usual, is probably an unsatisfying both. You pause to listen, and the soundscape has changed. The sharp cracks of advancing ice have softened into deeper, slower groans. This is mature ice, settled into its role. Occasionally, a long fracture opens somewhere far away, the sound traveling through ice and air like a distant drum roll. It's not threatening exactly, more administrative. The ice is adjusting budgets, reallocating pressure. A quirky tidbit drifts in. The Laurentide ice sheet was so massive that it may have subtly altered atmospheric circulation, influencing wind patterns far beyond its edges. In other words, this frozen giant didn't just reshape land, it nudged the weather itself. You imagine storms bending around it, clouds stacking differently because a continent-sized block of ice said so. Climate, apparently, respects mass. Beneath the surface, the situation is anything but static. Basal ice grinds forward, carrying rocks the size of cars, smaller stones, and endless sand. These materials scrape and polish the bedrock below, carving grooves that will one day guide currents and ship routes. You're standing above future shipping lanes, though right now the idea of a boat feels deeply unserious. Meltwater pulses through hidden channels under the ice, driven by pressure and geothermal warmth. You can't see it, but you can feel its effects in subtle surface collapses and faint subsidence. The ice sheet is not solid all the way down. It's layered, fractured, dynamic. Historians still argue whether large, stable subglacial lakes existed beneath the Laurentide during this time or whether water moved constantly, never settling long enough to form them. Either way, water is there, whispering under tons of ice. You make a small, tired joke to yourself about this being the worst possible time to forget your mittens, and the thought dissolves into the cold. Humor has a short half-life here. Still, there's a strange calm in knowing that the ice has finished arriving. This is not the chaos of advance, this is occupation. The Great Lakes region has been unified into one giant ice sheet, a single frozen authority with no opposition. The surface stretches on, subtly sloped, faintly shimmering. Sunlight reflects off snow grains like powdered glass. There are no shadows deep enough to hide in. Everything is exposed, simplified, reduced. You realize that if someone dropped a pin here, if pins existed, it would be carried along slowly, inevitably, toward the ice margin, a passenger on a journey lasting longer than most civilizations will ever exist. You take a breath, fog blooming and vanishing instantly, and accept that this frozen empire isn't temporary in any meaningful sense. It will outlast generations, stories, even languages yet to be invented. For now, the Laurentide holds the Great Lakes in a single, silent grip, and the world waits patiently, quietly, for whatever comes next. You start to feel it in your knees first, then in your spine, a subtle, creeping discomfort that has nothing to do with cold and everything to do with pressure. The world beneath you is bending, and even though you're just a temporary visitor, your body seems to pick up on the strain. This is the part no one imagines when they think about ice ages. Not just cold, not just glaciers, but weight. A mainstream fact settles heavily into place. The Laurentide ice sheet pressed down on the Earth's crust with such force that entire regions subsided by hundreds of meters, a process scientists call isostatic depression. The land didn't crack or snap. It simply yielded. You picture the crust like a floating raft on thicker, slower moving mantle below. Add miles of ice on top and the raft sinks. Remove the ice later and it rebounds, but not quickly, not neatly. Right now, the sinking is still in progress. The Great Lakes basins, already scooped and scarred by erosion, are being pushed even deeper like bowls pressed into soft dough. You're standing on a future low point, one that will eventually collect water again, though it doesn't know that yet. The surface of the ice gives no hint of this downward flexing. It remains calm, pale, almost serene. That's the unsettling part. Catastrophe, it turns out, doesn't always advertise itself. Underneath you, bedrock groans at frequencies too low to hear, adjusting grain by grain. Faults tighten. Old fractures wake up. Historians still argue whether this immense loading triggered earthquakes at the ice margins, small but frequent tremors caused by the crust struggling to accommodate sudden mass. If it did, you wouldn't want to be anywhere near them, unless you enjoy the ground gently reminding you who's in charge. You shuffle forward, boots scraping lightly, and imagine the numbers. A single square meter of ice 2 kilometers thick weighs roughly 2,000 metric tons. Multiply that by continents. Your brain refuses to cooperate, wisely opting out. Instead, you focus on sensation. The way the air feels heavier here, even though it's thinner. The way the horizon seems slightly curved, as if the land itself is bowing. A quirky tidbit sneaks in, almost cheerfully inappropriate. Long after the ice melts, the land will rebound unevenly, causing shorelines to tilt and ancient beaches to rise far above modern lake levels. Some future humans will find fossil shorelines hundreds of feet above the water and argue about whether the lakes shrank or the land rose. Surprise, it's both. The ice doesn't just leave marks, it leaves arguments. You kneel carefully and press a gloved hand to the ice. It's solid, unyielding, yet somehow temporary in a cosmic sense. Beneath it, water may be pooling, rock may be cracking, pressure may be redistributing minute by minute. This is not stasis. It's a slow-motion stress test for an entire continent. The Great Lakes region, now unified under ice, is at maximum burden. Rivers that once drained these basins are blocked or rerouted. Meltwater, when it appears, is forced to find new paths, sometimes flowing south, sometimes east, sometimes nowhere at all. Drainage systems are being rewritten without consultation. Historians still argue whether certain major North American river systems owe their modern courses more to glacial damming or to post-glacial rebound. The answer shifts depending on which river you ask. You stand again, joints protesting, and let out a breath that fogs and vanishes. A small joke floats up, something about needing better arch support for continental scale pressure, and you almost smile. Humor feels fragile here, but necessary. Without it, the scale becomes overwhelming. Above you, the ice sheet remains indifferent. It doesn't celebrate its dominance. It simply exists, heavy and patient. Below you, the earth accommodates, slowly, reluctantly. This quiet negotiation between ice and rock is shaping the future Great Lakes more decisively than any river or storm ever could. You take a few more steps, feeling the imagined sag beneath each one, and realize that this bending world is storing energy. When the ice finally leaves, much later, everything will respond. The land will rise, water will rush, shorelines will migrate. For now, though, all that drama is on layaway. You pause, steady yourself, and let the weight settle, not just on the land, but on your thoughts. The ice holds everything down, including urgency. The wind introduces itself before anything else does. Not with a gust, not with drama, just a steady, abrasive presence that never fully leaves. It scours the surface of the ice, picking up fine grains of snow and rock flour, and dragging them across the frozen plain in low, whispering sheets. You lean into it instinctively, shoulders hunched, realizing this is no longer a world of storms and calm days. This is a wind-dominated landscape, an ice desert. A mainstream fact slides in on that wind. During peak glacial periods, vast areas near the ice sheet were classified as polar deserts, receiving very little precipitation but experiencing intense, persistent winds. You squint ahead, and the horizon shimmers, not from heat but from cold distortion. Layers of air at different temperatures bending light just enough to make distance unreliable. Snow dunes ripple across the surface, aligned perfectly with the prevailing wind like frozen fingerprints. These aren't gentle drifts, they're hard-packed ridges that can strip exposed skin raw in minutes. The glacier doesn't need blizzards to dominate. It weaponizes dryness. The Great Lakes region, buried beneath ice, contributes to this desiccation. With surface water locked away, there's little moisture to feed clouds. What snow does fall tends to blow elsewhere, accumulating unevenly or vanishing into the distance. You're walking across what feels like a frozen ocean, but it behaves more like a desert plateau. Sound travels strangely here, sometimes forever, sometimes not at all, depending on how the wind feels about it. Fine dust coats everything. It works its way into seams, cuffs, thoughts. This dust comes from freshly ground rock, churned up by the glacier's relentless abrasion. When winds pick it up, it doesn't just settle nearby. It travels hundreds of miles, tinting skies and fertilizing distant lands. A quirky tidbit sneaks in. Some scientists believe glacial dust helped enrich soils far from the ice margins, indirectly supporting ecosystems that would later sustain human populations. Even here, in apparent emptiness, the ice is multitasking. You pause, turning your back to the wind for a moment, And notice how the cold feels different now. Drier, sharper, less forgiving. Moist cold seeps. This cold scrapes. It pulls heat from you efficiently, like it's been practicing. You make a small joke to yourself about missing cozy cold, immediately aware that such a concept does not exist here and never did. The sky stays stubbornly clear most days, a pale, high ceiling that reflects sunlight off the ice with almost rude brightness. Sunglasses would be a survival tool, not a fashion choice. Snow blindness is a real risk, though you doubt anyone's filing complaints. Historians still argue how much ultraviolet reflection from massive ice sheets affected regional climates and even biological stress in exposed organisms. The ice doesn't answer. It just keeps reflecting. Occasionally, the wind shifts, and you catch a faint smell, mineral, metallic, ancient. It's the scent of freshly exposed rock, stripped of soil and life, meeting air for the first time in millions of years. That realization lands softly but deeply. The glacier is not just covering the land, it's resetting it, scrubbing it down to fundamentals. You trudge onward, noticing how the surface subtly slopes away from the ice sheet's thick center. This slope drives wind patterns, accelerating air downslope in persistent katabatic flows. They're gravity-driven winds, cold and dense, sliding downhill whether you approve or not. Another mainstream fact, quietly brutal. These winds can reach hurricane strength near large ice masses, though here they're content to just ruin your day. You imagine standing here at night. The temperature would plummet further, the wind sharpening, stars burning cold and bright above a surface that gives nothing back. The ice desert would hum softly, grains skittering across its skin, the entire landscape in motion without ever going anywhere. Somewhere far to the south, beyond the ice margin, grasses bend under the same dust-laden winds, feeding animals that follow meltwater seasonally. Here, though, life is minimal, stubborn, microscopic. Survival has become a niche hobby. You stop, brace yourself, and let the wind pass through and around you, accepting that this frozen world isn't just cold, it's dry, abrasive, and endlessly patient. The Great Lakes sleep beneath it all, erased not only by ice but by air that refuses to carry warmth or moisture their way. You pull your coat tighter, even though it barely helps, and keep moving across the ice desert, every step accompanied by the soft hiss of snow grains racing the wind. You notice the tracks before you notice who made them, shallow impressions at the ice's edge, half filled with drifting snow, pointing not toward the glacier but along it. Nothing walks into this frozen mass unless it has a very short life expectancy. Life here survives by staying close, not committed. A mainstream fact settles in with quiet authority. During the height of the last ice age, most plants, animals, and early humans lived in refugia, ice-free pockets at the margins where meltwater, soil, and seasonal growth still existed. You follow the tracks in your imagination, pacing parallel to the ice wall where the world softens just enough to allow movement. Here, the wind is still cruel, but the ground occasionally shows through. Gravel, mud, stubborn tufts of grass that refuse to quit. In summer, using that word generously, meltwater streams snake away from the ice, brief ribbons of motion in an otherwise static landscape. These streams are lifelines. Everything orbits them. You catch a glimpse of movement, a shaggy silhouette in the distance, massive and deliberate. Mammoths favor this edge, grazing on sparse vegetation that thrives in cold, dry conditions. Their long hair, layered fat, and efficient heat retention make them perfectly suited to this in-between world. Mastodons browse nearby, preferring shrubbier terrain. Even predators, dire wolves, saber-toothed cats trail the herds, careful not to push too close to the ice itself. The glacier isn't prey, it's background. A quirky tidbit slips in as you watch. Some Ice Age animals likely use the ice margin as a navigational guide, following it seasonally the way modern animals follow coastlines. The edge of the ice functioned like a frozen shoreline, predictable in its unpredictability. You smile faintly at the idea of mammoths treating the Laurentide like a very cold ocean. Humans are here too, though not yet in large numbers this far north. They move cautiously, opportunistically, tracking animals, gathering what little the land offers. Clothing is survival. Fire is everything. They understand instinctively that the ice is both enemy and ally, blocking routes, yes, but also concentrating game and providing fresh water when it melts. Historians still argue exactly when humans first reached the southern edges of the Laurentide ice sheet and which routes they took. Standing here, you sense that certainty would be a luxury no one had time for. You crouch near a meltwater stream, listening to its thin, urgent sound. It's loud only because everything else is so quiet. This water carries rock flour, nutrients, and cold so sharp it stings your fingers instantly. Yet life clusters around it. Insects, small mammals, plants adapted to brutal efficiency. The ice has erased the Great Lakes for now, but it has created these fleeting corridors of survival. The glacier looms behind you, a white wall that reflects light and indifference equally. You crack a small joke about it being the worst possible neighbor, noisy, immovable, and constantly dropping debris, and immediately realize the comparison is unfair. Neighbors eventually move. At night, you imagine this edge glowing faintly under starlight, fires flickering in sheltered spots, people listening to ice groan and crack in the distance. Those sounds would be part of the world's bedtime soundtrack, unnerving at first, then oddly reassuring. The ice is still there. The meltwater still flows. Morning will come. The Great Lakes remain buried, but their absence shapes everything here. Without vast open water to moderate climate, temperatures swing hard. Summers barely qualify. Winters overstay. Yet life adapts as it always does, not by conquering the ice but by learning its habits. You stand, brushing snow from your knees, and take one last look along the ice margin. This is where the story continues, not on the frozen heart of the glacier, but at its restless edge, where survival means flexibility, patience, and never turning your back on the cold for too long. The sound startles you even though you've been half expecting it for a while. A deep, resonant boom that rolls through the ice and fades slowly, like thunder trapped underground. You freeze, heart racing, then realize the ground hasn't opened and the sky hasn't fallen. This is just the glacier talking to itself. As ice thickens and stretches, it cracks, shifts, and settles, releasing tension in dramatic but usually harmless ways. A mainstream fact anchors the moment. Glaciers constantly deform under their own weight, producing crevasses, pressure ridges, and internal fractures as they flow. You step carefully now because the surface has changed. The ice here isn't the smooth, wind-polished plain from earlier. It's broken, buckled, and scarred with long, jagged crevasses that vanish into blue-black darkness. Some are narrow enough to step over. Others yawn wide, edges feathered with frost, depths unknowable. You peer into one and feel your stomach drop, not from height, but from the sudden realization that the ice is not one thing. It's layered, fractured, restless. Light behaves strangely in these cracks. Sunlight filters down, scattering through dense ice, turning walls an impossible shade of blue. It's beautiful in a way that feels like a trap. You remind yourself, gently, that falling in would be the end of your journey and several future arguments about where you went. You take a cautious step back. From within the crevasses comes sound. Not echoes exactly, but groans, pops, long metallic sighs. The glacier adjusts as it flows over uneven ground beneath, stretching where slopes steepen, compressing where it slows. These stress patterns create the fractures you're navigating now. Historians still argue how often major crevasse fields formed over the Great Lakes region versus smoother ice cover, since later erosion erased much of the direct evidence. The ice, again, left few receipts. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you listen. Some early polar explorers described glacier sounds as resembling cannon fire or distant organ music, especially at night when temperature shifts were strongest. You can believe it. There's a rhythm here, almost musical, though the composer clearly dislikes melody. You edge along a safer route, noticing how debris collects near cracks, stones, dirt, even larger rocks carried up from the glacier's base. When fractures open, they bring the glacier's internal mess to the surface. This debris absorbs more sunlight than clean ice, subtly warming the area and encouraging further cracking. It's a feedback loop. Fracture, debris, heat, more fracture. Even in a frozen world, small imbalances matter. The darkness inside the ice feels alive, not in a horror movie way, but in a quietly biological sense. Microbes can exist here, feeding on minerals, surviving in conditions that seem impossible. Somewhere down there, in cold, pressurized darkness, life persists without sunlight, reminding you that the glacier is not sterile, it's selective. You stop to rest, letting your breathing slow, and crack a small joke about this being the worst possible place for a casual stroll. The humor is thin but grounding. The ice answers with another distant crack, as if unimpressed. Above you, the surface stretches on, but now you see it differently. It's not a static roof over buried lakes, it's a dynamic skin constantly reshaping itself. Beneath, pressure builds and releases. Meltwater may rush suddenly through fractures, refreeze elsewhere, widen cracks, collapse bridges. This internal plumbing keeps the glacier moving, talking, changing. You imagine the Great Lakes beneath all this, sealed away, listening to the ice's language from below. They're not gone, they're postponed. For now, the glacier dominates the soundscape, filling the world with groans and booms that echo across frozen plains. You step carefully forward, navigating between cracks, aware that every sound is a reminder. The ice is heavy, it is moving, and it has no obligation to be quiet about it. You wouldn't know it from the surface, but beneath your boots the ice is anything but dry. Hidden below miles of frozen weight, water is moving, quietly, persistently, and with a kind of secret urgency. This is one of the stranger truths of a frozen world, and a mainstream fact slides in smoothly. Even under massive ice sheets, meltwater can exist and flow, generated by pressure, friction, and geothermal heat from the earth below. The Great Lakes may be erased from the surface, but water has not given up its habits. You imagine it now, slipping through narrow channels at the ice bedrock boundary, squeezed by pressure so intense it lowers ice's melting point. The water doesn't pool politely. It rushes, surges, and sometimes backs up, carving temporary pathways that open and collapse without warning. These are subglacial rivers, unseen but powerful, rerouting entire drainage systems in the dark. Standing above them feels a bit like standing on a city while its subway system constantly redraws itself. Every so often, the surface betrays what's happening below. A shallow depression forms, then deepens, a subtle sag as water drains from beneath, leaving ice unsupported. You stop instinctively, heart thudding until the surface stabilizes again. Sinkholes in glaciers are rare here, but the idea is enough. The ice sheet is thick, yes, but it's also hollowed in places, honeycombed by motion you're not invited to observe directly. A quirky tidbit bubbles up. In some modern glaciers, scientists have discovered microbial ecosystems thriving in subglacial water, feeding on minerals and producing methane. If similar communities exist here, and historians still argue whether conditions beneath the Laurentide were stable enough for them, they would be living in complete darkness, isolated for thousands of years, unaware that they're underneath what will someday be Chicago. The water's pressure is immense. When channels block, meltwater can build up, sometimes releasing suddenly in powerful floods beneath the ice. These outbursts don't announce themselves politely. They rearrange sediment, lift sections of ice, and then vanish, leaving only subtle clues behind. You imagine the Great Lakes basins being quietly reshaped by these hidden flows, smoothed from below while the ice grinds from above. the soundscape changes again. If you kneel and press your ear to the ice, purely hypothetical bravery, you might hear it, a distant rushing, muffled and low, like a river heard through thick walls. It's comforting in an odd way. Flow means movement. Movement means the world hasn't fully frozen into permanence. Historians still argue how much of the Great Lakes' eventual shape was influenced by subglacial meltwater versus direct ice erosion. Did these hidden rivers carve channels that later guided lake outlets? Did they weaken bedrock, making it easier for ice to scoop deeper basins? The answers are buried under layers of retreat, rebound, and time. The water knows, but it's not sharing. Calm you stand again, brushing frost from your gloves, and picture the future. When the ice finally retreats, these underground systems will burst into the open, releasing floods that reshape landscapes in days that took millennia to prepare. For now, though, everything remains contained, disciplined, subterranean. The Great Lakes sleep above these secret rivers, unaware of how much work is being done on their behalf in the dark. And you, balanced between silence above and motion below, feel the quiet thrill of standing on a world that moves even when it looks completely still. You notice the ice isn't as polite as it used to be. Beneath the surface, pressures build in hidden chambers, and sometimes the glacier can't help but throw a tantrum. Surges of ice push forward, crack, and collapse unpredictably, moving kilometers in a matter of years, fast by glacial standards, slow by human ones. A mainstream fact anchors this chaotic behavior. Ice sheets often experience internal instabilities, with some sectors advancing while others stagnate, creating uneven surfaces and temporary ice dams. You can feel the tension just by walking on the edge, boots crunching over ridges formed in the last episode of its internal argument. Crevasses open suddenly, long lines of fracture that weren't there yesterday, or perhaps they were, hidden beneath thin snowfall. You carefully skirt these openings, wondering how the glacier decides when and where to move. It's almost as if it has moods. You chuckle quietly at the thought, a glacier with attitude, sulking over its latest misalignment. The joke is thin but keeps panic from creeping in. Sometimes entire lobes of ice surge, merging with neighboring flows and momentarily bulking up, only to settle again in a slow, grudging collapse. The process is mesmerizing and slightly terrifying. Rocks embedded in the ice are carried along, scratching bedrock, gouging out channels, and occasionally appearing miles from their origin. This is glacial plucking at its most theatrical, and historians still argue whether such internal surges contributed more to basin formation or simply rearranged debris atop pre-existing valleys. For now, the ice isn't concerned with our debates. A quirky tidbit flickers across your thoughts. Some ancient ice surges may have temporarily blocked rivers, creating massive lakes beneath or adjacent to the glacier. These waters would sit in hidden basins, pressure building, waiting for a catastrophic release. You shiver at the mental image of a subglacial dam suddenly failing, imagining a surge of water ready to rewrite landscapes in a matter of hours. The ice's movements aren't random. Gravity, pressure, and the subtle contours of bedrock guide it, but local variations create miniature conflicts. Some sections move ahead while others lag, producing tension ridges and folds. These folds make walking treacherous, yet fascinating, like navigating a frozen living puzzle. You step carefully, boots crunching over ice that seems to whisper warnings. Above, the wind remains relentless, carrying dust and snow, echoing faintly across ridges formed in previous surges. You make a small joke about the glacier throwing a temper tantrum and the wind acting as its drumline. The mental image is ridiculous, but the absurdity is comforting. Humor survives even here. You glance ahead and imagine what would happen if a surge undercut your path. A hidden ice river might suddenly reroute, a crevasse might widen, rocks might tumble. The glacier is a self-contained ecosystem of movement, exerting power in ways invisible to the casual observer. Historians still argue how much these surges affected early human migration along the southern edges of the ice sheet. But for you, the lesson is clear. This is not a stable world. You pause at a ridge, breathing slowly, letting the immensity of the ice's internal life sink in. Every crack, surge, and collapse is part of a pattern too vast to chart, yet too deliberate to be purely accidental. The Great Lakes region is no longer simply frozen. It's rehearsing a choreography of power, patience, and persistence. You watch, humbled, as the glacier continues its quiet battles, knowing that each conflict reshapes the future, 1 mile at a time. The surface changes again as you move southward along the ice margin. What was once a relatively smooth, pale expanse now resembles a chaotic quilt stitched together by pressure and time. Ridges rise unexpectedly. Crevasses twist in unusual patterns. You realize you've entered a zone where ice surges meet slower moving sectors, creating tension and compression that manifests in ridges, cracks, and subtle undulations. A mainstream fact: these ice margin zones were often the most dynamic parts of glaciers, changing constantly over decades and centuries. Walking here feels like balancing on a living, shifting sculpture. You crouch near one ridge, tracing it with a gloved hand. Embedded rocks jut out like stubborn teeth. Some are small, some are boulders lifted from miles away. Glacial erratics, they'll be called millions of years later, rocks transported over unimaginable distances by sheer ice willpower. You chuckle quietly at the thought. Rocks are world travelers now, far more adventurous than most humans. A quirky tidbit floats in. Some erratics are so out of place geologically that future humans will assume cosmic origins. Meteorites, they'll ask before geologists patiently explain ice did it. The ice, of course, doesn't care. It moves rocks because it can. You imagine the glacier shrugging. Very large, very cold, very indifferent. Meltwater appears sporadically along the margin. Small streams trickle from beneath the ice, following gravity's call, feeding into temporary ponds before freezing again. Life clings to these fleeting resources. Tiny plants sprout along edges. Insects buzz cautiously. Mammals graze nearby. It's a fragile temporary oasis in a frozen expanse. You notice the scale. These ponds are mere puddles compared to what will eventually be the Great Lakes, but for now, they matter immensely. Historians still argue whether these ice margin refugia influenced migration routes for early humans. Did small lakes, streams, and open patches guide bands of hunters and gatherers southward, offering safe passage and resources? The evidence is fragmentary, but the logic is compelling. You imagine these people stepping lightly along the ice's edge, constantly aware of the frozen titan looming behind them. The glacier hums and groans, sending long, low vibrations through the ground. You stand still, letting the sound pass through you. It's almost musical if you listen correctly, like a low drone punctuated by occasional pops and cracks. You make a small joke about the ice playing its own subwoofer set for a concert no one alive could attend. The humor sustains you. A sudden reflection catches your eye. Sunlight glints off a small crevasse, illuminating ice so blue it seems unreal. You imagine that color beneath the Great Lakes, an alien world frozen in layers of time, secret rivers flowing beneath, holding water and pressure in ways the surface cannot hint at. Even now, the glacier continues to sculpt, grind, and polish the bedrock beneath, setting the stage for the lake's eventual rebirth. Wind gusts across the ridges, carrying fine dust that glitters in the pale light. You breathe it in carefully, knowing the particles are ancient, mineral-rich, capable of traveling hundreds of miles. This is a frozen desert with supply lines, invisible yet effective, distributing nutrients and reshaping landscapes silently. You continue along the margin, careful with each step, absorbing the scale of what has formed. The ice sheet no longer feels like a distant presence. It is a vast, breathing entity, alive in its own unfeeling way, rewriting the map, redefining basins, and silently dictating the rules of survival. The Great Lakes may lie buried, but their eventual shapes are being honed under this patient, relentless hand. You trudge forward, boots crunching on the icy surface, and begin to notice subtle variations in texture. The glacier has matured. The uniform plains from earlier sections have given way to a complex topography of ridges, hummocks, and low, polished valleys. Each feature is a record of movement, pressure, and environmental interaction. You realize slowly that what appears to be a single continuous mass is in fact a patchwork of ice lobes, some advancing faster, some slower, some temporarily stalled by underlying bedrock obstacles. A mainstream fact: the Laurentide ice sheet advanced unevenly, producing lobes that funneled into lowlands and left behind complex glacial landforms such as drumlins, eskers, and moraines. You walk carefully around hummocks, some barely knee-high, others towering, sculpted from centuries of accumulation and compaction. You pause to touch a ridge that looks almost sculpted, its surface flecked with debris. Bits of rock, frozen soil, and tiny shards of mineral sparkle in the pale light. These are the glacier's souvenirs, carried from miles upstream, evidence of its power to move landscapes silently but relentlessly. A quirky tidbit: some erratics transported by the Laurentide ended up so far from their source that early geologists assumed they had been deposited by giant floods or even legendary icebergs. The ice, however, made no announcements. It just moved, stubbornly, imperceptibly, leaving humans to puzzle out the consequences later. You smile faintly at the thought. Even in immobility, the glacier travels. As you move, you notice small meltwater channels beginning to form on the surface, the first hints of the glacier's internal plumbing becoming visible. These streams are thin and fragile in appearance, but carry enormous energy relative to their size. Pressure builds underneath, forcing water along channels that widen the longer they flow. Some water disappears immediately into cracks. Other streams converge into small ponds along subtle depressions. Historians still argue about the prevalence of surface meltwater versus subglacial drainage during peak glaciation. Either way, the water is busy, secretly reshaping the ice sheet and underlying terrain. You crouch to peer into one of the emerging channels. Tiny particles of rock, suspended in the rushing meltwater, sparkle in a ghostly palette of blues and grays. This is glacial flour, evidence of the grinding and polishing happening beneath the ice. In thousands of years, these sediments will color rivers and lakes far downstream, providing a future generation with turquoise waters that seem almost too perfect to be natural. You marvel at the irony: destruction now, beauty later. The glacier, as always, is patient. The wind picks up, bringing with it a fine dust that scrapes against your cheeks and eyes. You pull a scarf higher across your face and move on. The wind carries minerals and fine sediments over hundreds of miles, enriching distant soils and sometimes even affecting vegetation hundreds of kilometers away. A quirky thought flits through your mind. This glacier is like a patient artist, dusting its canvas over continents, orchestrating effects far beyond its frozen boundaries. Yet for all its artistry, the ice is indifferent to spectators. You step over a crevasse that splits the ice into jagged halves, its depth unfathomable. Shadows pool at the bottom, hinting at hidden chambers and possibly subglacial meltwater flows. Beneath the ice, a hidden world of liquid water is moving relentlessly, lubricating the glacier's base, enabling surges and subtly eroding bedrock. The ice above, meanwhile, advances slowly but ceaselessly. You are aware of your smallness. A mainstream fact reminds you: the pressure at the base of thick ice sheets lowers the melting point, allowing water to exist and facilitate basal sliding, even at temperatures well below freezing. This duality, solid above, liquid below, is both beautiful and terrifying. Suddenly, the landscape shifts. You cross into a zone where two lobes of the ice sheet converge, pushing against each other with immense pressure. The surface ripples like waves frozen mid-motion, ice folds overlapping in complex, almost artistic patterns. You stop to admire the shapes, noticing the interplay of light and shadow across the undulating ridges. It's mesmerizing, like observing slow-motion tectonics frozen in time. Yet beneath your awe, a thread of anxiety persists. The ice can surge, and the folds you admire are temporary, potentially rearranged in decades. Patience here is both aesthetic and survival strategy. You glance at the horizon. Mountains in the distance appear as gentle slopes beneath the ice, their jagged peaks softened by centuries of accumulation. The Laurentide is relentless in its leveling tendencies, smoothing highlands, filling valleys, and obliterating previous topographies. Historians still argue whether pre-existing topography dictated lobe formation, or if the ice sculpted basins entirely independently. For now, the answer is irrelevant. You feel the magnitude beneath every footstep. Meltwater streams widen and converge, forming temporary ponds and shallow lakes along the ice margin. You imagine them teeming with microscopic life: algae, bacteria, early crustaceans. Even in this harsh environment, ecosystems cling to existence wherever water persists. Life, apparently, finds a way to exploit the tiniest advantages. It's humbling seeing resilience so literal and uncelebrated. You pause to catch your breath and notice the creaking, groaning hum of the glacier around you. These sounds are omnipresent, a symphony of stress, movement, and release. Sometimes a deep boom resonates for kilometers, other times a thin crack splits the silence. A quirky tidbit: early explorers often described these noises as musical or even communicative, like a language the glacier spoke. Of course, it's not communication in any human sense, but listening closely makes it feel intimate. You smile, appreciating the paradoxical comfort in alien sounds. The Great Lakes basins, hidden beneath this ice, are being molded in silence. Where once water pooled freely, now rock, silt, and ice conspire to carve channels, deepen valleys, and smooth edges. This quiet work is relentless. You remember reading about drumlins, elongated hills formed beneath moving ice. You wonder how many of today's small ridges are embryos of future drumlins, sculpted invisibly while you stand and watch. Historians still debate the exact processes behind drumlin formation, whether by subglacial deformation or sediment accretion. You shrug mentally. The glacier is impatient with debate. You move onward, crossing an expanse where the ice thins slightly. Meltwater flows beneath these thinner sections, occasionally surfacing in small rivulets. You observe subtle depressions where water has temporarily pooled, then refrozen. Each feature is a note in a complex score of glacial mechanics, water movement, and geomorphic processes. You're witnessing the rhythm of a frozen world, precise, patient, and indifferent. Animals cling to life along these margins. Shaggy mammoths forage cautiously near meltwater pools. Caribou follow sparse vegetation along temporary green patches. Predators track the herds, careful to respect ice margins. Life at the edge is delicate, opportunistic, and highly strategic. You notice how humans, hypothetical or real, would likely follow similar logic, avoiding the frozen interior while exploiting the periphery. The wind shifts, carrying fine dust and flakes of ice, scratching your cheeks. You laugh quietly, imagining the glacier filing complaints for harassment. Your humor is small but necessary, a tool for mental survival. Even here, you recognize the importance of small psychological victories. You cross into a zone where the glacier has pressed deeply into a former valley. Ice is compressed, the surface undulating like frozen waves. Embedded rocks protrude, hinting at violent past interactions where pressure plucked them from bedrock. Subglacial water likely flows below, creating temporary lubricated channels. You step lightly, aware of the unseen dynamics that could shift under your feet. Historians still argue about the exact configuration of ice lobes over the Great Lakes region, debating whether surges created temporary subglacial lakes that altered future lake outlets. You realize, standing here, that the ice has no interest in historical debates. It just performs them naturally, sculpting the landscape 1 meter, 1 ton at a time. As the day lengthens, or rather, as the subtle shift of light marks time, you notice how small weather events are exaggerated by the ice sheet. Winds channel along ridges, accelerating unexpectedly. Snow drifts pile against subtle slopes, sometimes covering meltwater streams in deceptive camouflage. Temperature differences across ridges can create sudden fogs or mirages, confusing the eyes. A quirky tidbit: ancient humans may have mistaken these illusions for otherworldly phenomena, adding supernatural explanations to natural ice behavior. You smile, imagining ghost stories with glaciers as protagonists. You continue along a ridge, boots heavy but steady, watching how sunlight dances across ice folds, making them glow faintly blue. The effect is hypnotic. You feel small, profoundly aware that the Great Lakes beneath this frozen mass are in hibernation, postponed yet alive in potential. Every valley, depression, and ridge is being refined, polished, and sculpted, silently awaiting eventual melt and renewal. Time flows strangely here. Hours, days, or even years blend seamlessly. The ice does not acknowledge calendars or clocks. It moves, shifts, and reshapes regardless of human measurement. Subglacial rivers pulse, the wind whispers, snow drifts settle and drift again. You feel simultaneously part of the process and entirely inconsequential. The ice sheet hums beneath you. Hidden water lubricates, pressure builds and releases, embedded rocks jostle, and the surface crests and troughs like frozen waves. Life at the margins persists, delicate and strategic. Every interaction, movement, meltwater, wind, is part of a grand choreography invisible to casual observers. Historians may debate the mechanisms, but you see them firsthand, almost in real time. You stop, looking southward where the ice gradually thins, imagining the edge where meltwater might emerge, streams might flow, and early humans might cautiously step forward. The glacier dominates, yet it shapes opportunity. Where ice presses, life finds ways to navigate. Where water flows, ecosystems cling and persist. Beneath all this, the Great Lakes are patiently waiting, and you, standing on this massive frozen expanse, feel both humbled and exhilarated. You are a witness to patient power, to slow-motion artistry, and to the quiet, unrelenting persistence of ice. You sense the future will unfold here. Lakes will return, ecosystems will thrive, humans will follow, but only because this frozen giant holds the world in meticulous, patient sculpting hands. You exhale, fog blooming and vanishing instantly, feeling the weight of ice, the hum of hidden water, and the invisible shaping of an entire region. Every ridge, every stream, every subtle undulation is a sentence in the story of the Great Lakes, told in the language of frozen time, pressure, and imperceptible movement. You step forward carefully, aware that each footstep is a tiny punctuation in the glacier's ongoing narration. You continue along the ice margin, each step a meditation on scale, patience, and silence. The terrain shifts again. Gentle rises become ridges, flat plains give way to hummocks and minor undulations. These are the fingerprints of ice movement, some recent, some ancient, showing the glacier's slow, deliberate negotiation with the earth beneath. A mainstream fact asserts itself. The Laurentide ice sheet sculpted not only the Great Lakes basins, but also countless minor features, including drumlins, eskers, and moraines, leaving a permanent imprint on North American topography. As you walk, you realize you are treading over evidence of processes that span millennia, their results visible but their full story hidden beneath layers of ice, snow, and memory. The ice beneath you is deceptively solid. You step carefully, boots crunching on a mixture of snow, ice, and embedded rock. Beneath the surface, the glacier is a dynamic, restless entity, with meltwater channels, sediment pockets, and pressure zones shifting continuously. Subglacial water is constantly carving hidden networks, lubricating the ice and redistributing debris. Historians still argue about the relative importance of subglacial versus surface processes in shaping these basins. As you walk, you sense that the answer doesn't matter. The ice simply does its work, indifferent to debate. You pause near a ridge, noting how sunlight catches the crystalline edges of ice, casting a pale blue glow across fractured surfaces. Crevasses snake away, revealing glimpses of the subglacial world below. Some are wide and threatening, others are narrow, mere whispers in the ice. You crouch, imagining water coursing through unseen tunnels, grinding rocks and carrying sediments that will later shape the lake's shorelines. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some subglacial streams are known to flow uphill, driven by pressure differentials rather than gravity, creating temporary anomalies that confuse even modern hydrologists. Here, you imagine such phenomena are routine, hidden beneath miles of ice. The wind has shifted again, bringing fine dust and rock flour from distant parts of the ice sheet. You pull your scarf higher and squint into the pale sunlight. The Laurentide's vastness is humbling. Stretching for hundreds of kilometers, it merges lobes, redirects meltwater, and redistributes debris over continents. Life here is marginal but present. Small meltwater ponds dot the ice margin, supporting mosses, algae, and hardy insects. Caribou graze cautiously along sparse vegetation patches, while predators track silently, aware that ice margins are as dangerous as they are nourishing. You notice subtle signs of glacial movement in the hummocks and ridges. Pressure ridges indicate compression zones. Elongated mounds hint at drumlins forming under persistent flow. Embedded boulders, some larger than cars, point to centuries of plucking, transport, and deposition. These features are both permanent and impermanent. They will survive ice retreat but shift subtly as the glacier adjusts. Historians still debate whether certain drumlins in the Great Lakes region formed primarily from sediment deformation or basal sliding. Standing here, you realize the answer is embedded in the ice itself, visible only to those patient enough to watch. Meltwater streams have become more prominent, converging into shallow channels that carve minor depressions in the ice surface. These streams are ephemeral but powerful, capable of eroding channels into the bedrock beneath the ice. The water is mineral-rich, carrying glacial flour that will color rivers and lakes downstream once the ice retreats. You kneel by a stream, letting your fingers trail through the icy flow, noting how it whispers and gurgles against stones. It feels alive, a small, liquid pulse in an otherwise frozen world. Above you, the surface of the glacier glints under sunlight, each crystal reflecting the subtle rhythm of ice flow. The sky is clear, a vast, pale canopy that stretches uninterrupted. The wind sculpts snow into delicate ridges, highlighting subtle contours in the ice. You step carefully along these undulations, aware that even minor missteps could send you sliding across polished ice or near a hidden crevasse. Humor becomes a survival mechanism. You joke quietly about needing an ice sheet survival manual just to make it to the next ridge. The ice's internal dynamics are constant. Pressure builds in hidden pockets, then releases with long, low groans. Crevasses widen, ridges compress, and meltwater redistributes, altering the balance of forces in ways invisible from above. You pause to listen, letting the deep, low hum of ice envelop you. It's a sound that resonates through your chest, grounding you in the scale of this frozen landscape. A quirky thought flits through your mind. This might be the most polite opera in history, performed entirely without an audience or conductor. You continue forward, observing how the ice margin creates temporary refugia for life. Meltwater ponds support small plants and insects. Mammoths and caribou graze along edges. Predators lurk nearby, respecting both the frozen interior and the opportunities at its boundaries. Life adapts here, opportunistically and efficiently. Historians still debate how these refugia influenced human migration routes during glacial maxima. Early humans would have had to navigate a constantly shifting landscape of ice, water, and sparse resources, relying on keen observation and improvisation. Time behaves strangely. Hours melt into days, days into weeks. You lose track of conventional measures. Instead, you track change. Ridges shift, meltwater flows, wind sculpts snow, and the glacier groans in low, persistent murmurs. Every step is both forward and stationary. Forward in distance, stationary in temporal scale relative to the ice. You feel simultaneously engaged and insignificant. Mammals and birds interact cautiously with the ice. Herds navigate meltwater streams. Predators track cautiously. Birds exploit ridges for nesting and hunting. Each species interprets the ice's rhythms differently, attuned to nuances invisible to the human eye. The Laurentide is both obstacle and framework, shaping movement, survival, and opportunity. It's a reminder that even immense power can coexist with delicate ecosystems. Embedded debris tells stories. Small stones, pebbles, and boulders trace paths from kilometers away. The ice has been a courier, delivering fragments of distant landscapes to this frozen edge. A quirky observation. Future geologists will marvel at these transported stones, misattributing them to catastrophes or floods rather than patient glacial travel. The ice's indifference is timeless. You cross a broad ridge, noticing subtle sagging in the ice. Meltwater has eroded channels beneath, creating depressions that affect surface flow. Each ripple, ridge, and depression is a narrative of motion, pressure, and patience. You step carefully, aware that even minor features can reveal the glacier's hidden dynamics. The sun dips lower, though not dramatically. Polar light is slow to shift, elongating shadows and highlighting surface textures. Crevasses gleam faintly, showing subglacial blue at edges. Meltwater channels glint, and the wind sculpts snow into sharp ridges that trace the glacier's flow. The Laurentide commands attention, demanding acknowledgement of its scale, power, and subtle artistry. You pause near a shallow depression, imagining the lakes beneath. They lie hidden, postponed, silent, yet alive in potential. Subglacial meltwater flows beneath, silently carving, lubricating, and reshaping. Embedded rocks shift imperceptibly. Pressure zones adjust. Life at the margins persists cautiously, opportunistically, creatively. Historians will debate the details of these interactions for centuries, but the ice simply continues its work, indifferent to speculation. Every step reinforces perspective. You are small, temporal, and fragile compared to the glacier's immensity, yet observation and patience grant insight. You notice patterns, rhythms, and interactions invisible from a distance. Meltwater flows, embedded rocks shift, pressure builds and releases, and life continues to exploit fleeting opportunities. The Great Lakes may be buried, but their eventual shapes are being meticulously crafted beneath this relentless, patient weight. The wind rises again, carrying fine dust and snow grains, sculpting subtle patterns across the surface. You walk into it, letting it brush against your face, reinforcing the glacier's dominance and the fragility of presence. Humor and awe coexist. You crack a quiet joke about negotiating rent with an ice giant and smile at your own absurdity. Yet the lesson is serious. This frozen world dictates terms patiently, relentlessly, and silently. You continue, noting small meltwater channels, subtle undulations, and ridges. Life at the margins persists. The ice groans and hums, pressure shifts, rocks pluck, slide, and settle. Subglacial water whispers, hidden yet potent. The Great Lakes basins are molded quietly, awaiting eventual rebirth. Every element, wind, water, ice, life, interacts in a choreography beyond human comprehension but entirely legible to those who observe patiently. By the time you pause for the day, you are aware of both the glacier's power and your own limitations. The Laurentide continues its slow, deliberate, patient work, shaping, sculpting, and enforcing conditions that will echo for millennia. You are a witness to the frozen giant's artistry, a small participant in a story that began long before you and will continue long after. You press onward along the ice margin, and now the scale of what you're witnessing begins to feel almost philosophical. The glacier has stopped being a surface to walk on. It has become a world in itself, a parallel ecosystem, a slow-motion civilization ruled by physics, pressure, and patience. You can feel it in your muscles as you climb a slight ridge, in your lungs as you gasp in the thin, icy air, and in the tiny shiver that travels up your spine. A mainstream fact anchors this moment. The Laurentide ice sheet at its peak covered approximately 13 million square kilometers of North America, with ice thickness reaching up to 3 kilometers in places, meaning entire forests, rivers, and human settlements were buried under a frozen weight unmatched in living memory. The ice is not uniform. You notice subtle tonal changes under the surface, the translucent blues of old compression ice, the dull whites of newly fallen snow, and streaks of sediment that trace its hidden paths. These layers are like a diary written over millennia, recording advances, retreats, melt seasons, and pressure cycles. You bend down, brushing your fingers across the surface. Each streak feels ancient yet immediate, an archive of processes that will shape the continent long after humans are gone. A quirky thought crosses your mind. If glaciers could speak, this one would probably sigh a lot and complain about the noise of the wind. The soundscape is alive. Beneath the constant whisper of the wind, you hear distant booms and groans. Some are ice settling, others are pressure releases. Occasionally, a sharp snap echoes, a reminder that what appears immobile is anything but. Crevasses open, widen, and close with the glacier's internal rhythm, revealing fleeting glimpses of the subglacial world. Meltwater streams shimmer in the faint sunlight, cutting ephemeral channels and carrying sediment that will color rivers and lakes once the ice retreats. Historians still debate how the interactions between these subglacial streams and the surface ice influenced the formation of the Great Lakes, eventual drainage patterns. You walk carefully along a ridge, noting embedded rocks of all sizes. Some are small, easily overlooked, but others are massive, plucked from bedrock kilometers away, transported in silence and dropped here by the glacier's sheer patience. Each rock is a storyteller, a courier from ancient highlands delivered to a new landscape. A quirky detail. Some erratics carried across the continent are composed of rock types completely alien to the surrounding terrain, prompting future geologists to speculate wildly about their origins, sometimes imagining catastrophic floods or other extreme events. The glacier, of course, has no interest in such debates. It simply moves what it must. Meltwater now forms shallow ponds and channels along the margins. These microhabitats, though small and temporary, support life. Mosses cling stubbornly to edges. Insects skim along water surfaces. Mammals, wary yet opportunistic, forage nearby. Predators track cautiously, aware that the ice margin is both a resource and a danger. Life adapts here creatively and cautiously, exploiting marginal advantages while respecting the glacier's dominion. You smile faintly at the thought that the Laurentide is simultaneously a destroyer and an enabler. You pause, kneeling by a shallow pond, and watch the water trickle under ice-laden channels, disappearing only to re-emerge elsewhere. Subglacial rivers, moving unseen, lubricate the glacier, carve channels into bedrock, and redistribute sediments. This hidden world is alive, dynamic and shaping the landscape beneath your feet in ways you cannot fully observe. Historians still argue how much subglacial water contributed to the eventual depth and shape of the Great Lakes, but standing here, you can feel its invisible presence. The wind changes, carrying fine particles of glacial flour. Each grain is a remnant of grinding, polishing, and transport, redistributed across the ice sheet and beyond. This dust will eventually fertilize soils far from the ice margin, enriching ecosystems long after the ice has vanished. A small joke surfaces. This glacier is like a meticulous chef, seasoning the continent according to its inscrutable taste. You laugh softly despite the cold biting at your face. You begin to ascend a more prominent ridge. The slope is subtle but unrelenting, revealing hidden crevasses and pressure ridges that complicate travel. Sunlight glints off ice walls, illuminating streaks of deep blue. These are older layers compressed over centuries, hinting at movement, stress, and survival. You step carefully, aware that beneath each foot lies not just ice but potential shifts, hidden water channels, and minute fractures waiting to betray inattentiveness. A fleeting vision appears. Mammoths grazing on sparse vegetation just beyond the ice, their heavy bodies bending low to reach whatever green exists. Caribou move in cautious groups, tracking seasonal resources. Predators linger at edges, studying, waiting, respecting the frozen interior. These margins are alive with opportunity and danger, a delicate balance of risk and reward. Life has learned to coexist with immensity, moving cautiously along the fringes of power. You note subtle differences in the ice's texture. Some areas glint with crystal-clear transparency, suggesting recent compression or refreezing. Other patches are dull and granular, indicating snow accumulation or surface melt that refroze unevenly. Embedded debris forms small, irregular patterns, evidence of ongoing plucking, grinding, and transport. A mainstream fact, these variations influence how ice flows, fractures, and melts, producing the intricate topography that will define post-glacial landscapes. The sun hovers low, elongating shadows across ridges and hummocks. Light reflects off crevasses, illuminating their subglacial depths in ghostly blue. Meltwater streams shimmer briefly, then vanish beneath thin ice bridges. The glacier hums faintly, a low, constant vibration you feel more than hear, resonating through boots, legs, and spine. You joke quietly about having been recruited for the world's slowest roller coaster, one that lasts centuries. You reach a plateau of sorts where the ice flattens and widens. From this vantage, the immensity is overwhelming. You can see the sheet stretching endlessly, merging lobes and tapering in the distance. Embedded rocks sparkle faintly. Subtle ridges indicate pressure zones, crevasses hint at hidden rivers, and patches of meltwater form tentative oases. Life is sparse but present. Birds skim overhead. Small mammals dart along the ice margins. The Laurentide commands both respect and awe. You crouch by a large crevasse, peering into its blue depths. Meltwater runs below, hidden but active, carving channels, lubricating movement, shaping valleys, and sculpting the foundations of lakes yet to come. You imagine the Great Lakes beneath this expanse, temporarily hidden but alive in potential. Their eventual basins, shaped by ice, water, and sediment, will echo this frozen world's patient handiwork. Pressure ridges rise and fall like frozen waves. You step carefully, observing how subtle gradients influence surface meltwater, ice flow, and embedded sediment movement. The landscape is a dynamic system, balanced between the rigidity of ice and the fluidity of water beneath. Historians still debate how these interactions influence specific lake formations, river reroutes, and eventual human settlement patterns. You smile at the realization that the ice's record is more precise than any historical argument could hope to be. Meltwater collects in shallow basins, reflecting pale sunlight. Tiny life persists here: moss, algae, insects, and small vertebrates. The glacier simultaneously provides and denies, enabling pockets of survival while asserting dominance over the majority of the landscape. You watch as a stream trickles down a subtle slope, carrying mineral-rich sediment, shaping channels and whispering hints of lakes to come. The wind sculpts everything. Snow accumulates unevenly, forming drifts that hide crevasses or highlight ridges. Ice dust glitters in sunlight. Subtle currents of cold air influence meltwater flow, erosion, and snow deposition. This choreography is invisible yet pervasive, shaping survival and geology alike. A quirky observation: future humans will find these patterns puzzling, imagining supernatural or catastrophic causes for natural formations that were patiently molded over centuries. You walk onward, tracing ridges, avoiding thin ice, and observing subglacial drainage indicators. The Laurentide is not merely frozen. It is alive with movement, pressure, and potential energy. Crevasses, ridges, and hummocks all tell stories of ancient stress, sediment transport, and ice behavior. You feel privileged to witness it, even in small, fleeting ways. By now, the glacier is less a surface and more a living topography. Meltwater, wind, embedded debris, and pressure converge into a dynamic system. Life exploits margins. Mammals graze cautiously, birds hunt opportunistically, and microhabitats flourish in small oases. The ice groans softly, shifting subtly with every movement. Historians may argue over timelines, mechanisms, and consequences, but you see it plainly. The glacier dictates terms patiently, powerfully, and endlessly. As the day, or what passes for day here, wanes, shadows stretch, and the ice glows pale blue in areas of compression. Subglacial channels pulse invisibly beneath your feet. Meltwater streams meander across depressions. Embedded debris glints like distant stars. Life persists where it can, constantly negotiating between opportunity and risk. You take a deep breath, fogging the icy air, and realize the Great Lakes, eventual basins, are silently forming, meticulously carved by forces beyond comprehension. You continue forward, feeling both humbled and exhilarated. The glacier's patient artistry dominates every sense. You observe its rhythms, listen to its murmurs, and imagine the hidden work beneath. The ice sculpts not only land but opportunity, survival, and potential. The Great Lakes may be buried, but they are not absent. Beneath miles of ice, water flows, sediment moves, and the landscape waits for its eventual liberation. The ice margin has grown familiar now, but familiarity does little to diminish its majesty or its intimidation factor. You trudge onward, boots crunching over snow-laden ridges, careful to navigate hummocks, subtle depressions, and hidden crevasses. Each step is a negotiation with the terrain, a balance between observation, instinct, and caution. A mainstream fact anchors this experience. Ice sheets of this scale advance and retreat not in days or months, but over millennia, carving, plucking, and transporting material on a scale so vast that even entire ecosystems are redirected. You are acutely aware that, in human terms, you are temporary, almost invisible against the glacier's patience and magnitude. The surface has changed yet again. Where once flat expanses dominated, now ridges, hummocks, and small depressions create a textured mosaic. Embedded rocks gleam in the pale sunlight, from tiny pebbles to massive boulders transported over unimaginable distances. These erratics, as future geologists will call them, are the glacier's silent messengers, evidence of power applied patiently and persistently. A quirky thought crosses your mind. One could imagine the ice as a delivery service with a cold sense of humor, moving rocks from distant mountains as though saying, "Here, enjoy this on your new landscape." You crouch near a shallow meltwater pond. The water is frigid, shimmering faintly in the pale light, carrying glacial flour that will eventually color lakes and rivers downstream. Subtle currents ripple across its surface, hinting at movement beneath the ice. Subglacial rivers pulse unseen, lubricating the glacier's base, eroding rock and carving channels that will guide future lake basins. Historians still debate exactly how subglacial hydrology shaped the Great Lakes, but from where you stand, it is undeniably active, a hidden hand molding the continent's future. As you continue, the ice groans, low and resonant like a living instrument. Crevasses crack sharply in the distance, pressure ridges shift imperceptibly, and the glacier's surface subtly heaves. These sounds are both threatening and mesmerizing, evidence of the immense energy stored and released in ways too slow or subtle for most humans to notice. A quirky tidbit: early polar explorers often described glaciers as singing or conversing, interpreting their creaks, groans, and pops as language. You smile at the idea, imagining the Laurentide offering commentary on human curiosity, though of course it has no such intentions. The wind picks up, carrying fine dust and rock flour that scratches your cheeks and sparkles in sunlight. Subtle drifts form along ridges, hiding thin ice patches and highlighting depressions. Meltwater streams meander along gentle slopes, sometimes disappearing beneath thin snow bridges, sometimes pooling to create temporary oases. Life clings to these margins: hardy mosses, resilient insects, grazing mammals, and watchful predators. This is a delicate ecosystem, existing entirely because the glacier provides opportunities, constraints, and occasional shelter. You notice the subtle gradients in the ice's texture: deep blues of compressed layers, granular whites of fresh snow, streaks of sediment tracing hidden flows. Every feature has a story, an origin, a journey, a destination. Embedded boulders hint at centuries of plucking and transport. Meltwater streams trace ephemeral paths, and pressure ridges narrate cycles of compression and release. Historians still debate the precise contribution of these processes to basin formation, erosion, and sediment deposition, but the narrative is clear in the ice itself. Observation is the only required discipline. Moving carefully, you approach a series of converging ridges where two lobes of the ice sheet meet. Here, compression is evident. Ridges twist, crevasses intersect, and hummocks rise and fall unpredictably. Subtle surges have occurred, leaving behind folded layers of ice, polished bedrock, and redistributed debris. The glacier's internal dynamics are on display: pressure, movement, and the occasional sudden shift combine to create a landscape simultaneously imposing and instructive. Meltwater channels widen along the margins, collecting into shallow ponds. Life continues to exploit these transient opportunities. Mammoths graze cautiously along sparse vegetation patches, caribou move methodically, and predators track with patience. Even birds navigate these treacherous edges, hunting insects or scavenging near meltwater pools. Survival here requires constant awareness, adaptability, and respect for the ice's dominion. You pause on a small ridge to observe the horizon. The Laurentide stretches endlessly, a living topography sculpted by pressure, flow, and time. Embedded debris glitters in the sunlight. Crevasses yawn like frozen scars. Meltwater flows in ephemeral channels. Shadows lengthen subtly, marking the passage of time in a place where days and nights are nearly indistinguishable. The glacier hums beneath, a constant reminder of unseen motion and hidden power. A quirky observation arises. The ice's subtle creaks and groans might be considered its heartbeat, a pulse too slow for humans but perceptible if one listens closely. You imagine the Laurentide as a sleeping giant, stirring occasionally, flexing limbs hidden beneath layers of frozen tissue. Humor tempers awe, offering perspective in a landscape that overwhelms by scale alone. Embedded rocks reveal histories of movement. Small pebbles, gravel, and massive boulders trace journeys from distant sources. Some rocks will eventually shape riverbeds, influence soil fertility, or become landmarks for human settlers long after the ice retreats. The glacier is both sculptor and courier, patient and indifferent. Historians still debate how far these rocks traveled along particular lobes, and whether subglacial transport or surface creep was dominant. Standing here, you appreciate that these debates are minor in comparison to the scale of action you are witnessing. You continue along the ice margin, mindful of crevasses and pressure ridges. The wind sculpts snow into subtle forms that both conceal and reveal the glacier's microtopography. Meltwater forms miniature rivers, carrying sediment and reflecting light in fleeting flashes. Life persists along margins, exploiting every resource the glacier reluctantly provides. The Laurentide's influence is pervasive. It governs movement, survival, and the timing of events across the frozen landscape. A mainstream fact reminds you, the Laurentide's advance and retreat cycles created long-term shifts in ecosystems, soil distribution, and water pathways. These processes ultimately dictated where rivers flowed, where lakes formed, and where human settlement would later occur. Standing here, you feel connected to the deep timeline of these interactions, millennia compressed into perception. The glacier hums and groans continuously, releasing energy in subtle shifts, sudden cracks, and occasional booming groans that resonate across kilometers. Embedded debris shifts imperceptibly, meltwater redistributes, and pressure zones realign. Life persists cautiously along the margins, negotiating risk and opportunity. Historians still argue about the influence of surges, subglacial water, and basal sliding on the eventual formation of Great Lakes basins, but you can see their signatures written in ice and rock. You pause near a shallow depression where meltwater pools glisten. Mosses cling stubbornly to edges, insects buzz quietly, and small mammals forage cautiously. Predators linger nearby, aware of both opportunity and danger. This microcosm is a lesson in adaptation. Life persists not by confrontation but by observation, patience, and careful use of marginal resources. Sunlight glints off crevasses and pressure ridges, illuminating deep blue ice in places and casting shadows across hummocks. The scale is overwhelming. You are a small participant in a system spanning thousands of kilometers. Embedded boulders, flowing meltwater, and wind-sculpted snow provide constant reminders that this landscape is alive with motion, even when it appears still. As the glacier continues its slow work, the Great Lakes basins beneath remain hidden yet active. Water flows subglacially, sediment redistributes, and pressure sculpts valleys and ridges. These processes are invisible but powerful, shaping landscapes that will emerge long after the ice retreats. Historians may debate timing and mechanisms, but the ice's actions are indisputable. You walk along ridges, cross shallow streams, and skirt hummocks, absorbing the glacier's vastness, intricacy, and quiet persistence. Meltwater trickles through hidden channels, animals exploit temporary habitats, and embedded debris tells stories of millennia-long journeys. The Laurentide ice sheet dominates the landscape, patiently crafting the future of the Great Lakes and surrounding regions. Finally, you pause, taking a deep breath of cold, mineral-rich air. The glacier hums beneath you, meltwater flows silently, and life persists cautiously at the margins. You feel the immensity of time, the patience of ice, and the eventual promise of rebirth beneath this frozen expanse. The Great Lakes may be temporarily buried, but they are alive in potential, waiting for the day the ice will retreat and reveal the landscape it has meticulously sculpted. The wind softens, losing its bite, and the glacier's groans mellow into a distant, rhythmic murmur. You slow your steps, letting the cadence of ice and meltwater fill your awareness. Life along the margins continues quietly. Mosses nod in the cold breeze, tiny insects skim across ponds, and distant mammals pause in fleeting observation. Each presence is delicate, ephemeral, and yet resilient, a whisper of survival in a world dominated by ice. You close your eyes briefly, imagining the Great Lakes beneath this frozen giant. They lie in suspended animation, cradled by ice and pressure, sculpted slowly into basins that will one day hold water, life, and human history. Subglacial rivers pulse beneath the surface, carving unseen channels, redistributing sediments, and lubricating the glacier's movements. Every ridge, crevasse, and embedded boulder contributes to this quiet choreography. You feel the vast timescales pressing gently against your perception, reminding you that patience is not only a human virtue, but a geological one. The sun dips low, elongating shadows across hummocks and ridges, painting the ice in subtle hues of blue and gray. Meltwater glints softly, reflecting a world both frozen and fluid. The wind carries fine particles of glacial flour, scattering them like a slow, deliberate snowfall. You inhale, letting the mineral-laden air ground you in this frozen reality, aware of your smallness yet connected to the glacier's patient work. As your pace slows, you imagine the future. Ice will retreat, lakes will emerge, ecosystems will flourish, and humans will navigate landscapes shaped by forces they could scarcely imagine. The Laurentide ice sheet's patient artistry will endure, etched into the land, whispered in meltwater, and remembered in sediment. You exhale, fog blooming and vanishing instantly, letting the final impressions of the glacier settle in your mind. Calm, patient, and enduring, the ice fades gently from immediate attention, leaving only the promise of what will eventually rise in its place. Sweet dreams.